Marcy and I are what you'd call a typical suburban couple, on the surface at least. I'm Nathan, 38 years old, and I run my own construction company, a small but successful business I started right out of college. Marcy, also 38, works as a marketing director for a local agency, juggling deadlines, creative campaigns, and a team of young go-getters. We've been married for 15 years and have 2 kids, Jack, who's 12 and just started middle school, and Lily, a bright and curious 6-year-old in kindergarten. Most days of life are about work, football practice, piano lessons, and family dinners. Our days are busy but fulfilling, rooted in the kind of stability we spent years building together. Looking at us now, it's hard to imagine that our story began as 2 kids in the same high school class. Marcy and I both grew up in the same small town, surrounded by cornfields and a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else. Back then, we were part of the popular crowd, though not the kind you see in high school movies. No cliques or drama, just 2 confident, well-liked teenagers. Marcy wasn't just beautiful. She was the kind of girl who seemed to have everything going for her. She was class president, co-captain of the cheerleading squad, and the lead in the school play. She had a magnetic presence. When she walked into a room, people noticed. But it wasn't just her looks or her achievements. There was an effortless charm about her, the way she made everyone feel like they mattered. I wasn't too far behind in the popularity department. I played varsity football, ran track, and had plenty of friends, but I didn't think much about relationships back then. I was focused on sports, school, and hanging out with my buddies. Marcy and I moved in the same circles, but she was dating someone else, a guy named Dylan, who seemed like the perfect match for her at the time. But during our junior year, things shifted. Dylan moved away after his father got a job in another state, and for the first time, Marcy wasn't tied to someone else. That's when I started to notice her in a way I hadn't before, not because of her looks, but because of her confidence and drive. She didn't wait for life to come to her. She went out and made things happen. It wasn't long before I decided to make my move. I started finding reasons to talk to her, staying after class to ask about assignments, or striking up conversations during lunch. At first, I wasn't sure she'd be interested in me, but to my surprise, she was. We clicked instantly, our conversations flowing easily as we discovered how much we had in common. By senior year, we were inseparable. Our friends joked that we were the golden couple of the school, and for once, the cliches didn't bother me. We went to prom together, shared our plans for the future, and started dreaming about a life that, at the time, seemed like it was years away. When graduation came, we faced the challenge of going to different universities. Marcy headed to a prestigious school to study communications, while I stayed closer to home for my business degree. But even distance couldn't keep us apart. We visited each other every chance we got, spending long weekends exploring each other's campuses and talking late into the night about our plans. 4 years later, when we both had degrees in hand, I proposed. The wedding was everything we dreamed of, grand, joyful, and filled with everyone we loved. Marcy's family was large and boisterous, filling the venue with laughter and stories, while my quieter relatives balanced it out with warmth and heartfelt speeches. Friends from school and college came from all over, making it a celebration we'd never forget. Life after that moved quickly. Careers started, kids came along, and we built a home together in a town not too far from where we'd grown up. It wasn't always easy, but it was ours, a life we could be proud of. When the announcement for our high school reunion arrived in the mail, Marcy and I were thrilled. 20 years felt like a lifetime and a heartbeat all at once. We talked for days about who might show up, what everyone was doing now, and how strange it would be to step back into the world where we'd first met. We had no idea that the reunion would bring not just memories, but also challenges we never saw coming. The weeks leading up to the reunion were a whirlwind of anticipation. Marcy and I spent evenings reminiscing about our high school days, flipping through old yearbooks and laughing at the haircuts and fashion choices we once thought were cool. We wondered who would show up and how much people had changed. Would Dylan, her old boyfriend, make an appearance? Would our classmates still recognize us, or would we all be strangers in a room filled with shared memories? There was a certain excitement to it all, a sense of stepping back into a chapter of our lives that felt both distant and familiar. Marcy, always the perfectionist, threw herself into preparations. She bought a new dress, an elegant bright red number that hugged her figure in all the right places, and spent hours choosing the perfect accessories. She joked that she wanted to remind everyone why she was voted prom queen, but I knew it was more about feeling confident and polished. I wasn't as meticulous, but I did make an effort. I pulled my best suit out of the closet, got it dry cleaned, and even considered updating my hairstyle, though Marcy assured me my usual look would do just fine. The kids were excited too, mostly because they'd get to spend the night at my parents' house. Lily loved sleepovers, and Jack was already planning which movies he'd marathon with Grandpa. It felt good knowing they'd be happy and cared for while Marcy and I stepped into this little time capsule from our past. The evening of the reunion arrived, and we drove to the venue together, a cozy event hall in town. The parking lot was already bustling with activity as classmates greeted each other with laughter and hugs, their voices filling the crisp night air. As we walked inside, the room was alive with energy. There was music playing, a mix of 90s hits, and the kind of upbeat tracks you'd expect at a high school dance. People mingled in small groups, their faces lighting up as they recognized old friends. The decorations were simple but thoughtful, with banners and photo collages showcasing moments from our shared past. Marcy and I were immediately swept into conversations. People remembered us. How could they not? We'd been part of the crowd that seemed to shine a little brighter, the ones whose names were always in the yearbook captions. It was flattering, even a little surreal, to hear people say how great we looked or to ask about our lives and kids. We moved through the crowd together at first, catching up with old friends and exchanging stories about careers, families, and the twists and turns life had taken. But as the evening progressed, we drifted into different conversations, pulled in opposite directions by the tide of familiarity and nostalgia. At one point, I noticed Marcy across the room, talking animatedly with a group of classmates. Among them was Dylan, her old high school boyfriend. It wasn't the first time I'd seen him that night. We'd exchanged polite nods earlier, but now, seeing him and Marcy laughing together, something stirred in me. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. It was more like a pang of recognition, a reminder of a time when I had to work to win her heart. Back in high school, Dylan had been my rival in more ways than one. He was confident, athletic, and charming, the kind of guy who seemed to have it all. When he moved away, I'd seen it as my chance to finally make an impression on Marcy. But that was years ago, I told myself. Now, we were adults, married with kids, with a life that went far beyond anything we'd known back then. When I joined their conversation, it was easy and light. We reminisced about old teachers, awkward moments, and the dumb things we used to think were important. Dylan seemed friendly enough, and Marcy was her usual charismatic self, steering the conversation and drawing people in. For a moment, I let myself relax, caught up in the nostalgia and the warmth of being surrounded by people who had been part of our shared history. Whatever I'd felt earlier faded away, replaced by a sense of gratitude for the life Marcy and I had built. The night of the reunion ended on a high note. As the music slowed and conversations wound down, Marcy and I walked back to the car hand in hand. She was glowing, her cheeks flushed from laughter and maybe a little wine. The event had been everything we hoped for: fun, nostalgic, and a welcome break from the busyness of everyday life. On the drive home, we talked about everyone we'd seen. Marcy chuckled about how some of the guys on the football team had let themselves go, and I joked about the way the class clown hadn't changed a bit, still telling the same bad jokes. She mentioned Dylan too, casually, saying how it was nice to catch up after all these years. Her tone was light, and there was nothing suspicious about it. I didn't think much of it at the time. Why would I? We'd been married for 15 years, built a life together, and faced every challenge side by side. Trust was something I had never questioned. The next morning, life returned to normal. Jack had soccer practice, Lily needed help with a school project, and Marcy had a work presentation to prepare for. We fell back into our familiar routines, the reunion quickly becoming just another happy memory to look back on. But as the week went on, I couldn't shake a feeling I couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy, exactly, but something about the way Marcy had lit up when talking to Dylan lingered in my mind. It wasn't unusual for her to be animated or warm. She had always been the life of the party. Still, there was something about it that stayed with me, like a tune I couldn't stop humming but didn't know the name of. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Marcy and I had been through too much together to let an old classmate stir up insecurities. But as the days passed, I noticed small things. Her mood seemed lighter, more playful, and she smiled more when looking at her phone. It wasn't enough to set off alarms, but it was enough to make me pay attention. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch after putting the kids to bed, she casually mentioned how Dylan had sent her some old photos from high school. They'd been part of a group project we all worked on together, back when we were juniors. She laughed as she showed me one of the pictures, a grainy snapshot of our team standing in front of a giant poster we'd made for the science fair. I nodded along, smiling at the memory, but something in her tone caught me off guard. She seemed almost nostalgic, like the photos had taken her back to a time she wasn't entirely ready to leave behind. Still, I pushed the thought aside. It was harmless, I told myself. Just old friends reconnecting after years apart. There was nothing wrong with that. As the days passed, I realized I was letting my imagination get the better of me. The high school reunion had stirred up old memories for everyone. Of course, Marcy would feel nostalgic. We had both spent some of the most formative years of our lives with those classmates, and it was only natural to reflect on that time with a bit of fondness. I told myself there was no reason to overthink it. The photos Dylan had sent were just snapshots of a shared past, frozen moments that didn't mean anything now. After all, I had my own moments of reminiscing too. Talking to old friends at the reunion had reminded me of how simple life was back then, when the biggest worries were passing exams or making the team. Marcy and I carried on with our lives as usual, navigating work, kids, and the busy chaos of daily routines. If anything, it felt good to see her so upbeat lately. The reunion had reminded her of the confident, ambitious person she'd always been, and that energy seemed to spill over into everything she did. One night, as we sat on the porch after dinner, watching the kids chase fireflies in the yard, I felt the tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying start to melt away. She leaned into my side, her arm brushing against mine, and talked about a project she was working on at the agency. Her voice was animated, her eyes sparkling in the dim glow of the porch light. In that moment, I felt foolish for letting my mind wander to darker places. Marcy and I had built a strong foundation together, one that wasn't easily shaken. The connection we shared ran deeper than any fleeting conversations or old photos. The following weekend, I even suggested we host a small dinner party with a few friends from the reunion. Marcy loved the idea, and we spent the day cooking, setting the table, and laughing about how we used to throw parties in our tiny college apartment. The evening was a success, filled with laughter and warm conversations. Life felt steady again, and I reminded myself that trust was the cornerstone of any good relationship. Marcy and I had weathered storms before, and this was just a passing breeze. But sometimes, even the calmest waters can hide unseen currents. It was a sunny Saturday morning when I decided to take Jack to his soccer practice while Marcy stayed home with Lily. We arrived early, the field bustling with parents setting up chairs and chatting while the kids kicked balls around. I took a seat on the bleachers, greeting a few familiar faces, and settled in to enjoy the game. That's when I saw him. Dylan was standing near the edge of the field, talking to one of the other dads. He looked much the same as he had at the reunion, confident, easygoing, and effortlessly charismatic. It wasn't surprising to see him there. Our town wasn't huge, and people from school often crossed paths. Still, I hadn't expected to run into him so soon after the reunion. He spotted me and made his way over, raising a hand in greeting. I stood, shaking his hand as he smiled and asked how life was treating me. The conversation started light enough. Small talk about work, family, and how quickly kids seem to grow up. Dylan mentioned that his son was on the same team as Jack, and we laughed about how our high school days felt both recent and distant at the same time. But as the conversation went on, I couldn't help noticing how smoothly he brought up Marcy. He mentioned how great it was to see her at the reunion and how much he'd enjoyed reminiscing with her. There was nothing overtly wrong with what he said, but something about his tone left a strange impression, like he was testing the waters, waiting to see how I'd react. I brushed it off, responding with casual remarks about the reunion and changing the subject back to soccer. Dylan didn't linger long, excusing himself to join another group of parents, and I turned my attention back to the game. But as I sat there, watching Jack sprint across the field, my thoughts drifted. Dylan's presence felt calculated. Maybe it was just me being overly sensitive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deliberate about the way he'd brought up Marcy. Later that evening, I mentioned running into Dylan to Marcy. Her reaction was casual, a simple acknowledgement that he'd mentioned his son played soccer. She seemed completely unbothered, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. People move back to their hometowns, raise families, and cross paths with old friends. There was no reason to overthink it. It was a week after that chance encounter at the soccer field when Dylan unexpectedly crossed my path again. This time, it wasn't in a casual setting or by coincidence. It was in a way that hit much closer to home. It was a Friday evening, one of those rare nights where Marcy and I managed to get the kids to bed early and enjoy a quiet moment together. We were sitting in the living room, sipping tea and flipping through a travel magazine she had picked up earlier in the week. She'd been dreaming of a family vacation somewhere warm and sunny, and her excitement was infectious. The knock at the door was unexpected, breaking the stillness of the evening. Marcy glanced at me, surprised. Visitors at this hour weren't common. I set my mug down and went to the door, opening it to find Dylan standing there, a sheepish grin on his face. He greeted me casually, explaining that he was in the neighborhood and thought he'd drop by to return something to Marcy, a folder of old photos from the reunion. He held it out, neatly tied with a piece of string. I glanced over my shoulder, calling Marcy to the door. She appeared moments later, her expression lighting up when she saw him. She thanked him warmly, taking the folder and flipping through it briefly, laughing as she pointed out a few snapshots. Dylan smiled, clearly enjoying her reaction, and made a joke about how much time he'd spent digging those out of storage. I stood there, watching the interaction. There was nothing overtly wrong, but something about his timing felt odd. Why bring the photos by in person? Why not send them through email, or simply drop them off without lingering at the door? Marcy invited him inside, offering him a cup of tea. I stepped aside as she led him into the living room, setting the folder on the coffee table. He made himself comfortable, launching into a story about how his son's soccer team had nearly won their last game, only to lose in the final minutes. As they laughed and talked, I observed quietly, chiming in where appropriate but mostly watching. Dylan's demeanor was relaxed, but his attention seemed to linger on Marcy just a little too long. When he finally left, after what felt like an eternity, Marcy turned to me, holding up the folder with a grin. She said how thoughtful it was of Dylan to dig these up, how nice it was to reconnect with people who had been such a big part of their high school years. I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, a nagging thought began to grow. Why was Dylan so interested in reconnecting now? He hadn't reached out in years, yet here he was, showing up at our door and sharing old memories like no time had passed. The next day, I pushed the thought aside. Marcy seemed genuinely happy, her mood lighter than it had been in weeks, and I didn't want to ruin that by overanalyzing. People reconnect with old friends all the time. There was no harm in it. But 2 days later, when Marcy mentioned that Dylan had invited her to a small reunion lunch with a few classmates, I couldn't help but feel the pang of doubt again. She explained it casually, saying that a group of them wanted to catch up since they hadn't had enough time to talk at the main event. I asked her who would be there, keeping my tone even. She listed off a few names, some I recognized and others I didn't. Dylan, of course, was among them. She didn't seem to think anything of it, adding that it would be a nice chance to see people without the chaos of the larger gathering. Still, something didn't sit right with me. It wasn't jealousy, not yet, but the pattern of Dylan inserting himself into our lives felt too deliberate to ignore. The morning of the lunch, Marcy dressed simply, opting for a casual blouse and jeans. She kissed me goodbye, reminding me to pick up Jack from soccer practice and double-check Lily's homework. I watched her drive away, her car disappearing around the corner, and tried to push the thoughts out of my head. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Dylan's intentions than just nostalgia. That evening, when Marcy came home, she was full of stories about the lunch. She described how they laughed over old stories and shared updates about their families. But when she mentioned Dylan had paid for everyone's meals, a flicker of unease returned. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was another piece of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. Life carried on as usual in the weeks following Dylan's unexpected visit and the reunion lunch. Marcy was her usual self, busy with work, attentive to the kids, and full of energy when it came to planning our next family trip. I kept my unease buried, telling myself I was reading too much into things. After all, Marcy had always been upfront about everything. There was no reason to believe she wasn't now. But Dylan's presence lingered, like a faint shadow that refused to fade. It wasn't immediate, but slowly, another invitation from him found its way into our lives. Marcy mentioned it casually one evening after dinner, as if it were nothing more than a passing comment. Dylan had suggested they meet up again, this time for a coffee. Just the two of them, to chat about some old-school project they'd both been involved in. The comment hit me harder than I expected. Something about the way she said it made my chest tighten. I let it sit for a moment before responding, my voice steady but firm. I told her it was starting to bother me, the way Dylan seemed to be reaching out to her so frequently. It wasn't jealousy. I trusted her, but I couldn't ignore how it felt like he was inserting himself into her life at every opportunity. Marcy stopped what she was doing, looking up at me with a mix of surprise and concern. She set down the dish she'd been drying and asked me why I was worried. He was just an old friend, she said, someone she'd known for years. What harm was there in catching up? I tried to explain that it wasn't about her actions, it was about his. I asked if she didn't find it a little strange that Dylan, who hadn't been a part of our lives for over a decade, was suddenly so eager to spend time with her. I admitted that his behavior was starting to grate on me, and that I didn't like the way he seemed to hover just at the edges of our life. Marcy sighed, leaning against the counter and crossing her arms. She assured me there was nothing to worry about. Dylan was just being friendly, reliving old memories. She said he probably missed the old days and appreciated having someone to talk to who shared that part of his life. Her tone was calm, almost amused, as she added that even if Dylan did have some lingering feelings for her, it didn't matter. She loved me, she said, not him. She'd never wavered on that, and she didn't plan to start now. She told me she knew how to handle herself, that she had no intention of encouraging anything inappropriate, and that I needed to trust her. Her words were sincere, and for a moment, they calmed the storm inside me. She had a point. Her loyalty had never been in question. If Dylan had feelings for her, they were his burden to bear, not hers. But the knot in my chest didn't fully loosen. I told her I trusted her, but I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that Dylan's intentions weren't as innocent as he tried to make them seem. Marcy promised she'd keep our conversation in mind and reassured me again that there was nothing for me to worry about. The tension in the room faded, and we went about our evening as if nothing had happened. A few days later, she mentioned that she'd agreed to meet him for coffee after all, despite my concerns. She said it would be a quick, casual meeting, nothing more. I didn't protest. Instead, I nodded, keeping my feelings to myself. Marcy had been honest with me, and I wanted to respect that. But deep down, a quiet unease settled in my chest. If Dylan's intentions weren't as innocent as Marcy thought, how long would it be before his actions crossed a line? Sometimes, trust can feel like walking a tightrope over uncertain waters. Marcy left for her coffee meeting with Dylan that afternoon, dressed casually but neatly, as if she'd put in just enough effort to look polished without overdoing it. I watched her drive away, my stomach tight with a feeling I couldn't quite name. As I sat in the house with the kids, my mind wandered to what was happening. It wasn't that I didn't trust Marcy. Her words had been clear, and she'd reassured me more than once. But Dylan's persistence, his timing, and the way he seemed to weave himself into our lives had left me uneasy. When Marcy returned that evening, the sight of Dylan's car pulling into our driveway stopped me cold. From the window, I watched him park, get out, and walk around to open the door for her. She stepped out, her movements a little loose, her laughter soft but unguarded. Dylan offered her his hand as she got out of the car, and she took it. He walked her to the front door, their voices low but easy. I couldn't hear what they said, but the body language was enough. She leaned against the doorframe slightly, smiling up at him as they exchanged a few last words. Then Dylan made his move. He leaned in toward her, his intentions unmistakable. Marcy froze for a moment, meeting his eyes, before she turned her head just enough for his lips to graze her cheek instead. He straightened quickly, brushing it off as casual, and gave her a small wave as he turned back to his car. Marcy stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a soft click. I was waiting in the living room, my arms crossed and my blood simmering just beneath the surface. She paused when she saw me, her expression a mix of surprise and slight apprehension. I asked her directly what she thought that was. What kind of coffee meeting ended with wine, laughter, and someone trying to kiss her? My voice was sharp, controlled, but the anger was clear. She blinked, caught off guard, and then rolled her eyes as if I were being ridiculous. She explained that Dylan had suggested a restaurant instead of coffee, that it wasn't a big deal, and that the wine had been a simple addition to the meal. I pressed her, demanding to know why she thought it was appropriate to be driven home by someone who clearly had more than friendship on his mind. Her response was firm, saying that she had handled the situation. She didn't let him kiss her, did she? She reminded me that she loved me, not Dylan, and there was no reason for me to overreact. But her dismissive tone only made my anger flare. I told her it wasn't just about the kiss he tried to steal. It was about the fact that she let the situation escalate in the first place. Her choices, her willingness to go along with his plans, were what stung the most. The argument built, each of us raising our voices as frustration spilled over. She accused me of being insecure, of letting my jealousy cloud my judgment. I told her it wasn't jealousy, it was about respect and boundaries. The fight ended abruptly when she stormed upstairs, leaving me standing alone in the living room, the echoes of our words hanging heavy in the air. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask but couldn't avoid. In the days following our argument, things between Marcy and me grew tense. On the surface, we kept up appearances for the sake of the kids, going about our routines and exchanging polite conversation. But there was an undeniable distance. Where there had once been warmth and easy communication, now there was an edge, a subtle coldness that neither of us acknowledged but both felt. Marcy seemed determined to prove that everything was fine, throwing herself into work and family life with renewed energy. She planned dinners and taught Lily a new song on the piano. For a while, I convinced myself that the argument had been a wake-up call, that she was making an effort to rebuild the connection between us. But beneath her busy exterior, something else was brewing. It started with small things, little moments that seemed insignificant at first. Marcy mentioned meeting up with an old college friend for lunch one Saturday, something she claimed she hadn't done in years. I didn't press her about it, wanting to avoid another fight, but the thought lingered. When she came home that afternoon, she was cheerful, her cheeks flushed and her voice animated as she recounted funny stories about her friend. I smiled and nodded along, but something about the way she glossed over the details didn't sit right with me. The following week, she mentioned a client dinner for work, one she claimed had come up unexpectedly. Again, I didn't question her, though I noticed she took extra care getting ready, curling her hair, wearing a dress I hadn't seen her pull out in months. She left with a bright smile and a quick kiss, promising she wouldn't be too late. That night, as I put the kids to bed and waited for her to return, my unease grew. When she finally came home, it was past midnight, and her explanation for being late was vague at best. She said the dinner had gone longer than expected, that her boss had insisted on one last drink, but the way she avoided my eyes as she spoke made my chest tighten. I started paying closer attention. Then came the night she mentioned meeting a friend for drinks after work. This time, I couldn't hold back. I asked who the friend was, and she gave me a name, someone I vaguely recognized from her office, a woman she occasionally talked about. But when she left that evening, something in my gut told me she wasn't meeting a coworker. I waited an hour before grabbing my keys and following the route I knew she'd take to town. I wasn't proud of what I was doing, but the unanswered questions had become unbearable. Her car wasn't at the bar she said she'd be going to. Instead, I found it parked a few blocks away, outside a dimly lit bistro. Through the window, I saw her sitting at a table in the corner, leaning slightly toward Dylan, her expression relaxed and her smile easy. They weren't just catching up. Their body language was familiar, the kind of closeness that spoke volumes. Dylan reached across the table, his hand brushing hers briefly, and she didn't pull away. I drove back home, my thoughts a storm of anger and disbelief. By the time she returned, I had calmed myself enough to avoid another argument. When I asked how her night went, she told me her friend had been in good spirits, that they'd had a great time catching up. The lie was effortless, slipping from her lips without hesitation. From that point on, Marcy's outings became more frequent. She always had an explanation, a name, or an excuse ready, and I stopped questioning her openly. Instead, I watched, waiting for her web of lies to tangle itself. The distance between us grew, but she didn't seem to notice, or perhaps she didn't care. Every time she walked out the door, I couldn't shake the image of her and Dylan together, their closeness, their shared smiles. The life we had built, the trust we had shared, now felt like it was hanging by a thread. Marcy thought her secrets were safe, but deep down, I knew the truth was only a matter of time. The tension between Marcy and me had reached a breaking point. Weeks of suspicion and unanswered questions had left me on edge, each new outing of hers feeling like a step further away from the life we had built together. I had tried to convince myself that I could wait for the truth to come to light, that the lies would eventually reveal themselves. But patience wasn't enough anymore. It was a Friday evening when she announced she'd be heading out again, this time claiming to meet a group of friends from work for dinner. The story sounded rehearsed, her tone casual but lacking the warmth I'd grown used to hearing when she was excited about an evening out. She dressed simply but deliberately, her hair styled neatly, her makeup subtle yet polished. As she walked out the door, calling goodbye over her shoulder, I made up my mind. This time, I wasn't going to sit at home and wonder. I was going to find out for myself. I waited 15 minutes before grabbing my keys and heading to the car. Her usual haunts were predictable by now. Restaurants, bars, and quiet cafes scattered across town. I drove toward the area she often mentioned, scanning the streets for her car. It didn't take long to find it. Parked on a side street near a wine bar, her car sat in the dim glow of a street lamp. I pulled into a spot down the block and killed the engine, my heart pounding as I watched the entrance. For a while, nothing happened. People came and went, groups of friends laughing as they stepped out into the cool night air. Just as I began to doubt myself, the doors swung open, and I saw her. Marcy stepped out, her arm linked with Dylan's, their laughter carrying faintly through the night. My chest tightened as I watched them walk together, their closeness unmistakable. They turned down the street, heading toward a park that stretched along the river, its paths lit by scattered lamps. I followed on foot, keeping a safe distance. The park was quiet at this hour, the only sounds the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. Marcy and Dylan strolled leisurely, stopping now and then to point out something or share a laugh. Then they stopped beneath one of the lamps, its warm glow casting their shadows across the ground. I stayed hidden behind a cluster of trees, my breath shallow as I watched Dylan step closer to her. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering just a moment too long. She didn't pull away. Their voices were too low for me to hear, but the body language said everything. Dylan leaned in, his face close to hers, and she tilted her head slightly, her posture relaxed, inviting. The kiss came slowly, as if time itself had slowed down to stretch the moment. His lips met hers, soft at first, then deeper. Her hands rested on his chest, and his arms wrapped around her, pulling her closer. I couldn't breathe as I watched, every fiber of my being screaming to intervene, to put an end to the scene unfolding before me. But I stayed rooted in place, my fists clenched at my sides, my nails digging into my palms. When they broke apart, Marcy laughed softly, her cheeks flushed. They lingered in each other's arms, their embrace close and full of the kind of passion that had once been ours. I couldn't take it anymore. Stepping out from the shadows, I walked toward them, my footsteps loud against the gravel path. They turned at the sound, their expressions shifting instantly, hers to shock, his to a mixture of surprise and fear. Marcy pulled away from Dylan quickly, her hands falling to her sides as if distance would erase what I had just seen. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand, stopping her before the lies could spill out. I told her I didn't need explanations. The truth was right there, glaring and undeniable. I asked her if this was the kind of friendship she'd been so eager to defend, if these were the meetings she had insisted were innocent. Her voice cracked as she tried to speak, stumbling over her words, but I couldn't hear her. My focus shifted to Dylan, who was frozen in place, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I stepped closer to Dylan, my anger boiling over. Before he could say a word, I shoved him hard, sending him stumbling backward until he hit the ground. He scrambled to sit up, his face a mix of shock and fear, but I didn't let up. I told him to get out of my sight, or I would not restrain myself. I would tear him to pieces right here if he said one more word. Dylan didn't argue. His hesitation lasted only a moment before he nodded, mumbling something incoherent, and hurried down the path without looking back. Marcy stood frozen, her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't bring myself to feel pity. I turned to her, my voice trembling with rage and disbelief. I told her she had ruined everything, our life, our marriage, and, most of all, the happy childhood our kids deserved in a full-fledged family. I asked her what hadn't been enough, what I hadn't given her, that she could throw it all away for something so meaningless. Her silence was louder than any excuse she could have offered. I turned and walked away, my chest tight, my mind a storm of emotions. When I reached the car, I sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The life we had built, the trust we had shared, was shattered beyond repair. Marcy would return home, no doubt ready with apologies and explanations, but the damage was done. The morning after everything came to light, Marcy tried to apologize. She followed me around the house, her voice trembling with desperation as she begged for a chance to explain, to make things right. She said it was a mistake, that it hadn't meant anything, and that she couldn't imagine losing what we had built together. But her words didn't matter to me anymore. I had heard enough the night before, seen enough to know that things would never go back to the way they were. Her tears, her apologies, even her promises to change, they washed over me like rain on stone. I told her I couldn't stay, that I needed space to think and rebuild. I didn't yell or argue. I simply stated that I couldn't live under the same roof with someone who had betrayed me so deeply. I told her I would be moving to an apartment and that it wasn't up for discussion. Packing my things was surreal. I moved through the house, the home we had built together, gathering clothes and essentials, my mind blank and numb. Marcy hovered nearby, asking if there was anything she could do, anything that might make me reconsider. I didn't answer. There wasn't anything left to say. Telling the kids was gut-wrenching. Jack, old enough to understand that something was wrong, sat quietly, his face pale and withdrawn. Lily, too young to grasp the full extent of what was happening, burst into tears, asking over and over why we couldn't just stay a family. I knelt down to their level, my voice calm but heavy with emotion, and told them that sometimes things change, even when we don't want them to. I promised them it wasn't their fault, that they had done nothing wrong, and that I would always be there for them, no matter what. I said it would take time, but things would eventually get better. I assured them that I'd visit every day after work and spend weekends with them, that nothing would ever stop me from being their dad. They clung to me, their small arms tight around my neck, and for the first time in years, I felt truly powerless. I moved out that same week, settling into a modest apartment on the other side of town. Marcy tried to reach out often in those early days. She sent messages, left voicemails, and even showed up at the apartment once, pleading for me to come home. She swore she would do anything to fix things, that she couldn't imagine raising our kids without me by her side. But I didn't budge. Her betrayal had cut too deep, and I couldn't let her words erase the image of her in Dylan's arms, laughing and kissing like the life we had built together didn't matter. Life settled into a new rhythm. I threw myself into work, spending evenings with Jack and Lily whenever I could. They became my anchor, the one thing that kept me from spiraling. As for Marcy, I kept my distance. She stayed in the house with the kids, and we kept conversations civil, focusing only on what was best for them. The pain of what she had done still lingered, but I didn't let it consume me. Whether I could forgive her or not, I didn't know. Time, I told myself, would have the final say. For now, all I could do was move forward, one step at a time, and hope that someday the answers would come.